Hey everyone, this is Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at what happened in June 2023 in paleontology. And there's some pretty interesting papers, so let's get started. First, we're going to be looking at the Sirius Passet Lagerstätte in Greenland, which has been really useful for telling some different things about different organisms that evolved during the Cambrian. It also seems like there's some different things that didn't exist in the more famous Lagerstättes from the same time period, such as the Burgess Shale, so really useful for showing some of the broader diversity around the world. Thulaspis tholops is this new organism that's been found, and based on it, it's at least somewhat close to the trilobites. It's not super close, and there's a few other things that we do know of that kind of help to fill in that gap, or might fill in that gap, depending on how exactly all of that taxonomy shakes up. Taxonomy's hard, you can check out my video on it for more, but essentially it looks like it's starting to get some of that kind of segmentation we expect in the trilobites, and starting to split the head up into the three different lobes for which the trilobites are named. But again, not super close. Some of the features just aren't quite there yet, such as the shapes of the eyes. Trilobites have really distinctive eyes because of how they were built with calcite lenses, so something very specific to them. But apparently it doesn't seem like this new animal, Thulaspis, actually has that. Speaking of calcite eyes and lenses, we're actually going to be looking at calcite in eggs, because the eggs that actually are produced can have different amounts of certain isotopes of oxygen in them. And that means we can start telling certain things about the environment. These researchers weren't doing anything specifically about the environment though, they were just looking at the methods to try and see which one works best. And there have been other papers recently that have used these methods and said, hey, dinosaurs at least had some slightly varying body temperatures. This one though looked at those methods and went, okay, so what we really need to do to be more reliable on the data we're getting is rather than using kind of a mortar and pestle and grinding all of these eggshell pieces into a dust and analyzing those chemically, we should instead be using a drill bit that's spinning really fast and then just kind of touching that to parts of the eggshell and taking that dust and analyzing that instead. Just because there's less variation in what you're actually getting from a single sample. Because when you put it all into a mortar and pestle, you might be picking up other things, whereas with the drill bit, especially a new drill bit, you're getting pretty much just the sample you want. Some of the egg fossils that have had this kind of study done have come from the Dinosaur Park Formation, and there's some really good fossils coming from this formation, including some dinosaur mummies, specifically of hadrosaurs. And one of the feet from these suggests something different than from another hadrosaur mummy that comes from a little bit later in time. The later specimen, named the Dakota specimen, shows some of the digits in the hand being preserved in almost a mitten-like configuration, where the different fingers are actually all compressed into just one large lump of meat and flesh, and it would have worked for it walking around. Meanwhile, this older one shows one of those fingers actually sticking out separately from that same kind of lump of meat. So we can't really just assume that the hadrosaurs all had this very late evolving type of foot. We need to really consider that no, they had a lot of different life strategies, and they lived over millions and millions of years. That makes sense that they're not all going to be exactly the same. The Dakota specimen comes from the Hell Creek Formation, which a recent dissertation suggests is one of the most at-risk fossil formations for poaching. And this might sound a little odd, but it is one of those things where researchers want to be able to have these fossils so we can learn more about them. And oftentimes on public lands, so Bureau of Land Management lands, National Forest lands, and National Park lands, these are protected. They're supposed to stay there until researchers can come and confirm what they are. Unfortunately, this dissertation, which goes into great detail, it's 65 pages long before you start getting to tables and figures and things, again, great detail, it mentions that there's really not a lot that these different entities can do because they don't really have the robust staff to be able to actually document everything that's on these public lands and then also document if it's still there or not. So it's really hard to try and get a good idea of what's actually happening in many of these places. They also looked at sites and even some of the different gem shows that do sell fossils. And what they found is dinosaur material is by far the most sold pieces of the fossil record. And that does mean that other fossils that occur in these kind of dinosaur-bearing formations, like the Hell Creek Formation, are going to be more likely to get poached. And that's not to say it's entirely dinosaurs. There's a lot of mammal material from things like the White River group as well. But it is something we need to be aware of, because that way we can start understanding what's being sold, what's being poached, and what that means for our understanding of the fossil record. And this isn't a problem unique to the United States. In fact, there's a lot of fossil poaching which occurs in Brazil, which they've started wrapping their hands around a little bit better. And one of the most poached areas is the Crato Formation, which has shown a new fossil flower closely related to the lotus flowers. And it seems like it's pretty consistent with many of the modern traits we see in lotus flowers. such as having certain adaptations for a hollower stalk in order to actually balance in the water better, as well as large photosynthesizing leaves that would have sat at the surface of the water, and the stalk coming up to a flower. And the flower seems like it would have been pretty different from the modern lotus flowers. Modern lotus flowers are known for being very beautiful flowers, and this is kind of a odd-shaped flower. Really early in the development of flowering plants, so that makes sense that it wouldn't quite have all the same adaptations that we do see in modern-day representatives of the lotus flowers. But it is neat to know that they evolved this far back. And on the subject of plants in the Cretaceous, when the big rock hit the planet, we mostly think about animals and especially the dinosaurs dying out. But a lot of the plants also suffered, and this study tried to essentially go around to a lot of different places and quantify how much they did. And what they found is there was still a lot of die-off of many plants. Up to 50% of species died out. However, importantly, at the family level, so when you push back a little bit further from just species, you actually see that there wasn't that much die-off. So if one species of pine tree died off, you could look at some of its closer relatives, and at least one of them would actually have survived that extinction. So that may have been why it didn't quite be as devastating for many different kinds of plants. That said, it is important to note that before this extinction, the gymnosperms, so things like pine trees and cycads and ginkgos, were much more common. Meanwhile, after this extinction, you had many more angiosperms or flowering plants. So while this species didn't really have the same kind of family level effects, those species losses still had big implications for how different plants would actually start to develop, especially the grasses and the rainforests that really dominate large portions of the planet today and are very important for our global ecosystem. As for animals that would have been around some of the earlier forests with a lot of those pine trees and cycads, we have Wulong, which comes from China, and it's actually known from a juvenile specimen, which is interesting because that means it's not fully grown. If we can tell something about its color, for example, we can say, okay, yeah, sure, they didn't have this in adulthood, so it's not necessarily breeding plumage or something. The thing is, we can do that with many of these fossils coming from certain Lagerstätte in China, because they actually have melanosomes preserved. These are little packets of material that help to give color and oftentimes strength to different feathers in many different dinosaurs. And by comparing the shapes of the melanosomes from these fossil animals to modern day animals' melanosomes, we can kind of estimate what the animal would have been colored like. And what they found is it would have been mostly black and gray and slightly iridescent, kind of like a crow or a grackle if you're near me and there's plenty of grackles around. This is really similar to another related dinosaur, Microraptor, also from the same area. And that's interesting, because again, it doesn't suggest that this was some sort of breeding plumage because this was a juvenile animal. It also suggests that maybe this was very important for the structural integrity of the feathers, because this was fairly early in feather evolution, and we find this in a lot of different animals, and we do know that the very long-shaped melanosomes that are present in many of these animals with iridescent plumage do help to strengthen the feathers so they're less likely to break or become damaged. This may have been a very important adaptation before the kind of molting pattern that we do see in modern-day birds actually started to evolve. There's also some older rocks in a similar region that also preserve a lot of fossils. This is the Yanliao Biota. And based on this study, they weren't actually looking at anything in it, rather than the isotopes that were in it, so that they could try and understand how old it was. And what they found is that at the oldest, it's probably about 164 million years old, and at the youngest, about 157 million years old. So we have about 7 million years of rock that has some really good fossils preserved, and some important ones, including some very early mammals, some very early salamanders, as well as some fairly early dinosaurs that are starting to try and take flight, like the Scansoriopterygids. So it's really important for being able to understand all these organisms and put their evolution into a time-based framework. There was also a paper on Shri, a dromaeosaur, so a raptor-type dinosaur that was fairly small and actually accidentally preserved, almost identically to the velociraptor meme, which is a little bit funny. But importantly, it helps to show some different things about how some of these forms coming from the Gobi Desert were, and how some of the ones from the North American continent were. Shri is interesting because it actually shows some convergence between it coming from Asia, and specifically the Gobi Desert, as well as some of the North American dromaeosaurs. That said, when looking at it phylogenetically, it's still really closely related to the animals from Mongolia, specifically Velociraptor. The main convergence seen is the elongation of the antorbital fenestra, something we do see in the North American relatives. However, we don't have the entire maxilla, so it's really hard to say if it also had that same convergence. Meanwhile, in Velociraptor, we really don't see that elongation of the antorbital fenestra, meaning that potentially these animals were just going after different prey. And for whatever reason, maybe in North America there was more of that prey, so we see that adaptation being more widespread. It's hard to know for sure. It's interesting because it helps us to understand a little bit more about how these different animals' dynamics would have interacted with one another, especially since they would have oftentimes been living in similar environments. So hopefully we'll be able to understand them a little bit more in the future, but it is really interesting to see this kind of convergence from something that's not very closely related to them. There was also a new ankylosaur found, this time coming from Europe and specifically the Wulong group of the United Kingdom. And it was actually found in the middle of the Wulong group, which is a little funny because it doesn't seem like it's very closely related to either of the other ankylosaurs known from the group. Firstly, Hylaeosaurus, which would have been about 3 million years older than Vectipelta, as well as Polacanthus at the top of the Wulong group, which would have been about 7 million years younger or closer to us than Vectipelta. There's been other fossils, but mostly incomplete, of ankylosaurs from the Wulong group, and in general they've just kind of all been thrown into the Polacanthus as just, yeah, it's probably Polacanthus, don't worry about it too much. Now that we know that there's something else different there, and importantly, it doesn't seem really closely related to Hylaeosaurus or Polacanthus. Instead, it seems like it's more closely related to the ankylosaurs coming from Asia, meaning that it's not just as simple as, yeah, the European animals and dinosaurs did their own thing, and then everything else did their own thing. No. Some of these Asian animals were migrating into Europe, and pretty far into Western Europe. So hopefully we'll get some more fossils of different ankylosaurs from this time period to kind of better understand what the heck was going on with them. Because it's a little strange to see some of these patterns that are actually developing as we start to collect more data. On the subject of many of those Asian dinosaurs from the Gobi Desert, there's also a new one, and it's really just an arm, so it's hard to say exactly what it was phylogenetically, but there is enough to give it a new name. Migmanychion laiyang is this new theropod, and there's enough of the arm to say that it's a Maniraptorian, so not just a dromaeosaur or raptor dinosaur, but potentially an oviraptoran or a therizinosaur. There's a number of odd different groups in that larger group. Interestingly, though, when they actually did the phylogenetic analysis, they consistently found it very close to Fukuivenator, which last year was actually found to be pretty closely related, if not the earliest diverging therizinosaur, which were these mostly herbivorous to omnivorous in some of the early forms theropods that got to really, really large sizes, particularly in Therizinosaurus. So this could just be another early one of those. However, in the phylogenies, they never actually found Fukuivenator to be a therizinosaur, and by extension, they didn't find Migmanychion to also be a therizinosaur. They're some kind of early Maniraptorians, probably, but we really don't know where to place them just yet. But hopefully we'll get some more fossils, and then we'll know something more about them. Because it is a little frustrating seeing so many fragmentary fossils being found and go, yeah, it's kind of weird. We need more to say anything more about it. Just one of the rough realities of paleontology. And there's still more new dinosaurs, this one coming from North America and being named Iani smithi. And it's actually kind of interesting because it kind of fills in this gap between some of the smaller bodied ornithopods that lived during the late Jurassic, things like Dryosaurus or Camptosaurus, and some of the larger but still mostly medium-sized ornithopods that lived in North America during the middle-ish Cretaceous. The Cretaceous isn't divided into a middle, so it's kind of more just the early late Cretaceous and the late early Cretaceous. But things like Tenontosaurus, which is famous for getting eaten by Deinonychus in almost every art that it's depicted in. With Iani, though, the researchers were able to make a new phylogeny and found it to be part of a group called Rabidontomorpha, which were mostly relatively small to medium-sized ornithopods, with one exception from Australia, which potentially just happened because the other animals didn't get there, and so Muttaburrasaurus could fill in that larger herbivore niche. Some representatives of this family have also been found in Europe during the very late Cretaceous, like Zalmoxes, so they were pretty successful and pretty widespread. But based on how they group up, it's probably a bit more likely that rather than diversifying and then spreading everywhere, they evolved, kind of spread everywhere at low diversity levels, and then diversified in their various locations. There's also another new ornithopod being described, this one coming from the very, very late Cretaceous of Chile, which is interesting because in general, the late Cretaceous is mostly dominated for ornithopods by the hadrosaurs. And this is a closely related animal. It is a non-hadrosaurid hadrosauriform, so just outside of the true hadrosaurs. And it seems like it did pretty well. Named Gonkoken nanoi, it's really interesting also that it ended up in Chile, because from what we know, it seems like the hadrosauriforms actually evolved in parts of Eurasia. So that means this animal at some point either migrated through parts of Asia into Africa and then across the Atlantic Ocean, which was much smaller then because the continents had only started to break up fairly recently, and then made it into South America and lived there. Or potentially, it may have migrated across the Bering Strait into North America, and then down across the ocean and gap that was there, because South and North America weren't connected yet, and then made it into South America and succeeded there then. Based on the phylogenetic study, it's fairly closely related to Eotrachodon, which is from Alabama, so the North America hypothesis does seem a bit stronger there. And as for broader taxonomy and how different dinosaur groups are related to each other, there's been some debate about that. And that's specifically if it is Ornithischia and Saurischia, or if there's some other different combination of these three main groups of the dinosaurs. This paper didn't try and actually find out how they evolved directly, but instead it wanted to try and understand how statistically well supported are any of these ideas, and what it found is they're all really, really poorly supported. So, for example, you have the traditional Ornithischia and Saurischia splits, with the Saurischians also including things like the theropods, and then also the sauropods. But sometimes you can swap these around, depending on the study in question. So there's a lot of debate that's still going on about this, and while most researchers seem pretty well set on Ornithischia Saurischia, this paper goes, hey, statistically we really don't have enough evidence for that. It may just be some sort of bias in the phylogenetic matrices we're using and what characters we're choosing to care about. In fact, depending on the statistical test, some of the other ideas, like the Ornithischiformes, were actually more supported than the traditional split up that we've had of these early dinosaur groups. So there's a good chance that something might be changing with this in the future. This paper also didn't use silosaurs as dinosaurs, which some people have argued they're the earliest Ornithischians. So while we're getting some better statistical tests to say, hey, we really don't know more, there's also still a lot more data out there that we could try and start bringing into this. So hopefully we'll start to see some of that and get a better idea of how the dinosaurs actually first evolved and then diverged into many different groups doing many different things. As for the lifestyle of certain dinosaurs after they evolved, we actually have a Lagerstätte coming from France that doesn't really have a lot of fossils described from it. I've been told that they are going to do more with it, so hopefully we'll get more of it. But for this case, they just went, hey, we have 61 femurs or femora from ornithomimids. And it seems like they're all the same species based on the rest of the skeleton. So we 3D mapped some of these femurs because they looked different from one another. And we found they basically plotted into two separate groups. This suggests there is some kind of sexual dimorphism, which is just the males and females have different body types. And so this means that then we would have been able to understand how these organisms would have actually engaged in the environment, with at least one of the sexes trying to woo the other ones, most likely. And it's easy to say, hey, it's probably the males. May not have been. But importantly, we are actually starting to find some well-supported evidence for dimorphism in dinosaurs, something that's historically been hard to prove because we normally don't have 61 separate samples of a single species of dinosaur. So really nice to see this kind of statistical work being possible. And also I hope we actually get full descriptions of these dinosaurs and many of the other things from this Lagerstätte. We know it exists. People haven't really talked about it that much. Quichusaurus was a relatively common marine reptile in the Triassic of some parts of China. And it was so common, in fact, that we can also do some of these statistical tests. And it's not a dinosaur, it was related, but it was much more closely related to other reptiles that went back to the water, like the plesiosaurs. Importantly, though, again, we have enough we can do some of these statistical tests, and these researchers also found dimorphism mostly in the shape of the humerus, where it seems like probably the males in this case had a more triangularly shaped humerus. It was a little bit more robust. There's also enough here to say, hey, this was a slow growing and slow developing trait. So essentially the humerus was basically identical throughout most of these animals' youth, between the males and the females. And then at some point there was likely some sort of hormonal change in the males, which caused them to develop a more robust humerus, either for more aggressive paddling and food collection, or potentially just fighting off rivals. But it is something that's really cool that we can actually start to see in how these animals actually reached puberty and began to be able to approach sexual maturity. Staying in the water but moving to mammals, we also have one of the earliest known bear relatives, and it's been named Eoarctos vorax. Now, it's also fairly early in this lineage, so it's probably more like the common ancestor of not just the bears, but also many of the other caniforms that we do know from in this group. So things like raccoons or civets. So pretty generic body plan. However, there are a few traits that are really nice for understanding what it was probably doing. For example, its molars are actually slightly flattened, which suggests potentially it was eating hard food. Its jaw was also pretty wide, which means it may have been eating hard food. all of the fossils that we have of Eoarctos have been found in channel stream deposits, meaning it was probably spending a lot of time around the water, and potentially that means that it was eating hard-shelled things around the water, like crawdads or clams. It also probably would have eaten other things like fish, but this just happens to be what it was most adapted for eating. It also suggests that because it's about the size of a raccoon, that maybe if the bears went extinct today, something like a raccoon would be the next thing to kind of fill that large-bodied predator herbivore niche, omnivorous niche, I guess, which would be kind of wild to see, you know, a 500-pound raccoon. Be a little terrifying as a trash panda, I think. You know, just thoughts that might keep you up at night. Staying with mammals but moving even further into the water, we're going to be looking at whales, specifically a new species named Olympoccetus thalassodon. And it was a relatively small whale by modern standards. It was only about 3 meters in length, but that makes it the largest of the group it belonged to, Cymocidae. It also has some traits that show some similarities to some of the later whales, like modern whales, which show a wide variety of different methods of catching prey. But it also had teeth and a tooth count more similar to that of some of the older, earlier whales like Basilosaurus. So it's this weird kind of transition from things like Basilosaurus into things that are more like modern whales. It's just very interesting to find this. It also helps to add to diversity of whales in the Pacific Northwest, because we found a few there already and now there's more turning up. There's also new whale fossils coming from Cuba, and it's just some teeth, so we really can't say with great distinction what kind of whale it was, other than it was a Physteroideae whale, which means it's somewhat closely related to sperm whales, but also the dwarf and pygmy sperm whales, which, you know, they're around, they're less well known, but they are around. So it could have been anywhere in those size ranges, at least as far as it would have been once it was an adult. This makes only the second set of whale fossils to be found in Cuba, which is unfortunate. It's, you know, in the Caribbean Ocean, there should be a lot more fossils there, and we just can't really find many of these because of the political differences which exist between Cuba and many other countries, most notably mine. Hopefully that'll end though, because we're already starting to find more and more fossils in Cuba, such as a giant triggerfish that was described just a few years ago. It'd be really nice to get more access to these fossils so we can try and understand how the Caribbean actually evolved and developed as an ecosystem into what it is today. Myohe metakoi is a new species of dolphin coming from New Zealand about 25 million years ago. And this one had some really bizarre tusk-like teeth, and they're relatively short and stout rather than being long and pointy like narwhal tusks. This has caused the researchers to suggest it was probably for hunting, and that it would have used a hunting strategy not that dissimilar from that of a modern-day saw shark, essentially swinging its head back and forth and stunning and or otherwise chopping in half fish, and then more calmly collecting the pieces. Which is interesting, just adding a lot of diversity to what we thought we knew about whales. And a big jump back in time to the Triassic again, and in the Triassic oceans, specifically with the animal Tanystropheus, which is most known for having an incredibly long neck. It's very bizarre and probably used that neck to sneak up on schools of fish without getting its entire body right next to the school of fish. Would have made it a little easier to hunt. Unfortunately, it may have also made it easier to be hunted, because we have 2 different species of Tanystropheus, each of which has fossil evidence of being decapitated in a predation attack. There's bite marks at the end of the neck that got chopped off. So, really rough time to be a Tanystropheus if you're one of those 2. But it's really interesting and really helps to show that even pretty quickly after the Permian-Triassic extinction, the most devastating extinction in the history of the planet that killed up to 95% of life in the oceans, that there were already very complex ecosystems starting to develop. You have these small fish and squid, something eating them, and then something large enough to eat their predators as well. And Tanystropheus was pretty large. The neck could get up to 10 feet long in the larger species and still got decapitated, which, again, rough for it, but neat fossil. Jumping again into the oceans with Megalodon this time though, so much closer to the recent day, there was a new study trying to look at the isotopes of the teeth of Megalodon. And what they found is that the teeth were probably about 7 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding water. And that's because the teeth will pick up different elements that are around the animal as it's swimming, but also so will all of the ocean sediments that are around it when it would have swam. So we can actually compare those 2 levels of isotopes and get some sort of sense of the temperature. It's important to remember, though, that the teeth would have still been closer to the water, so some of the internal parts of the shark may have been even warmer, potentially more than 20 degrees Celsius warmer than the water surrounding it. And this includes the stomach, which may have helped to aid in digestion, which is important for the next paper, because the next paper looked at also megalodon teeth, but not the teeth you're thinking of. Sharks grow teeth on their skin as well that are pretty small, but they help essentially water flow over the body and make it more streamlined. We're pretty sure these are the denticles or these teeth scales from Megalodon because they were found with 73 Megalodon teeth. So essentially the shark died, all the teeth stayed basically where the head was, all the cartilage rotted away because cartilage just doesn't preserve as well, but all of the little denticles, the teeth scales, fell down behind the shark. And so by looking at those sediments, we can go, hey look, this is what Megalodon teeth scales looked like. And they're not particularly ridged, which is something we do see in faster swimming sharks. This means Megalodon would have been much slower than in some other papers that have suggested cruising speeds of about 5 kilometers per hour. Instead, it would have been closer to 2 kilometers per hour, so a lot slower. However, it still would have been able to do big bursts of speed when hunting. And that's important because that slower speed means it could have potentially maintained a higher body temperature, which, again, we talked about in the last paper. But also, since it would have been taking large bites of its prey, which were whales, that higher body temperature may have actually helped it to digest that food more efficiently. So it's really interesting for how we're finding two different lines of evidence that Megalodon was both fairly warm, but also importantly, maybe slower moving so that it could eat more food. Just really interesting concept to understand how these animals' biology would have worked. Ceratosaurus dali is the newest named mosasaur, and it's actually the oldest known mosasaur from North America. It lived 93 million years ago, and belonged to the plioplatycarpine mosasaurs, which were fairly moderately sized, maybe reaching up to 20 to 25 feet. So not the giant monsters like Mosasaurus. But importantly, it showed up earlier in North America. So potentially that means these smaller ones were able to start colonizing the Western Interior Seaway, this large seaway that covered all of North America, or at least all of the central part of North America, during the Cretaceous. And then later on, things like Mosasaurus, which was a larger predator, were able to come in and start doing even more heavy predation on the organisms that lived there. It's just interesting to see how not necessarily all of them showed up at once. Maybe there was a few different waves of migration of mosasaurs from one part of the planet to the other. And the mosasaurs were lizards, and they had some lizard relatives on land that did survive this extinction, such as the glyptosaurians. Now, the glyptosaurians were actually anguilomorph lizards, so you can think of them as being closely related to things like alligator lizards, or the teiids. Like the alligator lizards, they had osteoderms, or essentially bone armor in their skin. And there's a new one coming from France that really suggests a lot of interesting things about how they survived that extinction, and that they did pretty well. Solavania gallica is this new lizard from the early Eocene of France, which means it's only a few tens of millions of years, if that, younger than the extinction that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs. And we know some of the glyptosaurians did live in North America before the extinction, and we also find them there after that extinction. But not only that, they were able to survive in North America and then migrate to parts of Europe. And again, only a few million years afterwards, meaning they had crossed all of Eurasia to get there. So they were a pretty successful group of lizards that seemingly did fairly well up until just a few million years ago, which, unfortunate, but it is really neat to understand that there was more lizard diversity not that long ago. Skinks normally aren't super large, although a few have been able to reach pretty large sizes, like the blue-tongued skinks of Australia, or even the Great Plains skink, which can reach about a foot in length or a bit around 30 centimeters. But a new fossil coming from Australia is distinctly the largest known skink ever in history, and it was actually pretty closely related to some modern-day skinks in the genus Telequa, which is the blue-tongued skinks and the shingleback, and it was actually found to be pretty closely related to the shingleback. This new one has been named Telequa frangens, and it would have been much larger at over 5 pounds or over 2.4 kilograms, so massive, massive lizard. But also interestingly, it seems like it may have been filling a niche that just Australia didn't have filled at that point, which is that of turtles in the desert southwest today. It would have probably been fairly heavily armored, meaning it would have been pretty good at digging like many of those skinks are today, and then also would have been just walking around eating plants, like turtles do today. So it's really interesting to see this convergent evolution between admittedly two reptile groups, but not very closely related reptile groups. Super neat to see. I wish they were still around because I'm sure seeing a 5-pound skink would be very interesting. It'd be almost as large as my cats. And finally, when we're talking about evolutionary time, we're often talking about things that are at least as old as Toliqua frangens, which lived about 15,000 years ago. However, sometimes we find things that lived much, much closer to today, such as when a giant gecko was found in a drawer at a museum in France. And we went, hey, this is taxidermied. That's odd. And it was kind of assumed it came from New Zealand, so it was given the name Hoplodactylus delcordi. But now researchers have been able to actually pull out a femur from the taxidermy and do some genetic testing and go, hey, it's not related to anything from New Zealand. It's actually very closely related to a lot of geckos from New Caledonia. And this includes some very famous geckos like the modern day largest gecko, the Leachianus gecko, but also crested and gargoyle geckos, some things that are very common in the pet trade. Because of this, they actually moved it into a different genus, an entirely new genus even, Gigarcanum. So it's currently the only known gecko that belongs to that genus. And again, it was very large, over twice the size of the largest gecko today, again, the Leachianus gecko. And it might still be out there. Again, this was taxidermied, so it couldn't have been collected that long ago. Based on how it was taxidermied, the researchers suggest that it was put into the collections by at least the 1870s. And it was probably collected in the 1830s based on how the taxidermy was actually made, essentially the techniques for taxidermy that they used. So we have a pretty good date that it was collected somewhere in the middle of the 1800s. And that sounds pretty bad that nobody else has seen one since then, but even the crested gecko, now known all over the world as a great animal that you can find in pet shops that are all domestically bred and not collected from the wild anymore, it was first found in 1866, and it was thought extinct until the 1990s. So there's a lot of really rough, rugged terrain in New Caledonia, and maybe somebody just needs to get out there and see if they can find another giant gecko. Oh, my foot. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Really appreciate the support that we do get on these videos. They take a lot of work to write, look into many papers, edit, get out there, and they oftentimes don't do as well as some of the other videos. So any support you can do by even just watching it in the background or joining our Patreon really does help. With that all said, I want everyone to be safe, take care, don't go extinct,